Unionville. She looks at me. It's not a town. Well, yeah, it was in 1870 and 1880 because it's in the census as a town in 1870 and 1880. But of course, it's no longer a town. It's part of Easton. But I don't care. We're doing it anyway. Why are we doing it? So, because it's interesting. It's interesting to me. And hopefully it'll be a little bit interesting to you. What makes it interesting? Well, a couple of things. Number one, surprise, surprise, it's black. Now that in and of itself is interesting, but it's not completely distinctive. How do I know that?
It's upside down.
I got a book. It's called The Black Towns. Okay? And according to this book, between the end of the Civil War and World War I, over 50 black towns were established throughout the United States. Many of them out what was then the West. Interestingly, this book lists 50. Now, Unionville is not among them, which I found sort of amazing, but that's the case. Another book, as long as I'm on books, relative to Unionville. Have any of you seen this book? It's called Praise the Bridge That Carries You Over. I've got one nodding head. Okay, this is an oral history. An oral history. This gentleman, Joseph Sutton, who grew up on Miles River Neck, we'll talk about that, where Unionville is located. He spent some time in Unionville, spent more time in Copperville, which is another black town on Miles River Neck. And Shepherd Kresh, K-R-E-C-H, worked with him. Shepherd Kresh is an anthropologist from Easton, interestingly enough, who came across this gentleman when he was like 90 years old and recorded his recollections of growing up and coming to maturity on Miles River Neck. It's really pretty darn fascinating. So those two books. So again, Unionville, it's black. It was settled in part by black veterans. We'll talk about that a little bit. Much is made of that fact. In fact, later on, you'll see a slide listing, allegedly, ostensibly, the 18 black veterans of the Civil War, that settled Unionville. So that's a second distinction. Third distinction is it's still there. Most of the black towns that are in that book ain't there anymore. Or, if they are there, they're not black anymore. If they really became viable, whites wanted in on the action. And some of these towns have become white towns as opposed to black towns. And then the final distinction for Unionville, this black town settled in part by black veterans, was that it was founded by whites, a group of Quakers, who we'll talk about in a little bit. So you take all that together, and Unionville is a pretty distinctive place. So we're going to talk about it a little bit. And Unionville is part of the, what to call it, quandary, maybe you might call it, that faced freed slaves after the Civil War. I mean, the slaves were freed. But what did that mean? Well, for most, what it meant was hit the road, Jack. That's what it meant. They weren't given much of anything except literally the shirt on their back. Now go and fend for yourself. There was one effort by the federal government to help free slaves, which lasted for all of about 2 years. What was that called?
40 acres and a mule.
Excuse me?
40 acres and a mule.
What was the organization called?
Oh, the Freedmen's Bureau.
The Freedmen's Bureau, okay, which was established in the federal government. I think it was in the War Department, if I'm not mistaken.
Headed by generals.
Yeah. Which was there sort of to support these newly freed slaves, sort of to make sure that they minded their P's and Q's and went to work. Freedmen's Bureau had a very difficult time trying to administer this thing. 4.5 million freed slaves in a sea of 8 million hostile whites. It was a mission impossible, and after 2 years, Congress said, enough, you're done, and the Freedmen's Bureau was over. So, these freed blacks needed to make some decisions for themselves. What were they going to do? And really, there were two basic impulses that you could sort of see in terms of how the former slaves went about living their lives. One impulse was, we need work. We got to put bread on the table. Where is their work?
Plantations.
Plantations run by
It's their former owners.
their former owners. Okay? So many former slaves went back doing what they were doing, where they were doing it, when they were slaves before the Civil War. And even if it wasn't on the plantation where they were slaves before the Civil War, it was on the plantation next door. Some of them took off to find husbands or wives that they'd been separated from during slavery, and then got jobs on a plantation someplace. But the underlying theme there was back working for the white man. There was another impulse, though, for some blacks. And that impulse was
To go north. To go north.
well,
Come to
it was to go any place
Home ownership.
that they could get out from under the thumb of their former owners. Going north, at least initially, was not much of an impulse, simply because the North was unknown, pretty much. I mean, you might as well have been talking about going to Mars or the moon as going to New York or Chicago. A few did, not many. But many tried to separate themselves from whites. We've had 250 years of being under the thumb of the white man. We want to get as far away as we possibly can. And it's that impulse that led to Unionville, a home of their own. So, before we talk, though, about Unionville, we're going to talk a little bit about the geography of where Unionville was established. Unionville, as I think many of you are aware, is located in this rather distinctive area of Talbot County called Miles River Neck. Miles River Neck has Unionville, Miles River Neck has Copperville, Miles River Neck has Tunis Mills, okay? 3 towns, sort of towns, okay? Unionville and Copperville were historically all black towns. Tunis Mills, historically, an all white town. But really, Miles River Neck was not known as a settled area. It was not known because it had these 3 really villages. Miles River Neck was better known as an area that really had plantations, large farms, and there was no larger plantation than the W-Y-E plantation. Unfortunately, on this map, it's a little bit off the map to the north, okay? If this map was to go up another inch or 2, you would see the Y plantation. Anybody been over to Y House? Got 1 person, 2 person, 3 person, 4 person, 5. Y House is still there. Y House is still, as best I know, owned by the family that
It's never been sold.
settled it some 1670, more or less, and is considerably shrunk in size because at one time the Y plantation took up much of the northern section of Miles River Neck. And the Y plantation was established. What's the name of the family?
Lloyd.
Lloyds. Okay. Edward Lloyd. Edward Lloyd, the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th. 7 Edward Lloyds. Okay. The first one came to Miles River Neck back, as I said, in the 1670s, 1663. The exact date, arrives in Talbot County and establishes a farm plantation. And then he goes home back to England. But his son, Edward Lloyd II, really is the one who puts down the Lloyd family roots on the Y plantation and becomes governor, the colonial governor of all of Maryland. So the guy had some clout. Already you're seeing that the Lloyds have political influence, becoming the governor of Maryland. Edward Lloyd V becomes a United States representative, becomes a United States senator, and becomes governor of the state of Maryland in the period of the 1820s and 30s. And his son, Edward Lloyd VI, really expands the agricultural operation. In fact, he's known as Edward Lloyd the Farmer. And it's under Edward Lloyd the Farmer that one particular enslaved individual takes up residence for a short term, takes up residence. That's a euphemism for was enslaved on the Y plantation. The best known probably enslaved individual in the history of the United States, Frederick Douglass, except his name wasn't Frederick Douglass at the time. What was Frederick Douglass's name?
Bailey.
Yes, Bailey. Joseph Bailey.
Frederick. He was Frederick.
No,
Frederick Washington Bailey.
Yeah, I'll have to check that one out. Douglass is enslaved at the Y plantation for a while. Does not have a happy experience because just about no slave has a happy experience being a slave. One other, what's interesting, actually, the two best known enslaved individuals in the history of the United States were 20 miles from each other. Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman. Harriet was not in Talbot County. She was across the river.
Georgia.
Yeah. And escaped from there. Douglass escaped from Talbot County in the 1830s, and Tubman escapes in the 1840s, except Tubman makes a practice of coming back. I think she came back 9 times, 7 times or 9 times to bring others out of slavery. In any case, Miles River Neck, the Y plantation, becomes really the heartland of slavery, not just in Talbot County, but pretty much in the Eastern Shore. Certainly the largest plantations in Maryland, and the Y plantation is the largest plantation in all of Maryland, and one of the 50 largest plantations in the entire South. It has over 400 enslaved individuals on it. 400. In fact, the Lloyds had so many enslaved individuals on their plantation that they have excess. And so what are they going to do? What do they do with them?
Rent them out.
Excuse me?
Rent them out. Rent them out.
They did do some renting, but that didn't relieve them entirely because renting is only for a period of time. Ultimately, you're still stuck supporting the individual.
Sell them to the cotton plantations in the South.
Yeah, they established plantations in the Southwest and shipped a couple hundred of their enslaved individuals sent to the Southwest, to Mississippi and Alabama, I believe, and established plantations there as well. Okay. Interestingly, even though many Black individuals in Talbot County were slaves, an equal number were not slaves. By the time of the Civil War, half of the Black population of Talbot County was free. Now, how come? Why were there all these free Blacks here in Talbot County
Quakers.
prior to the Civil War?
Quakers and Methodists.
Excuse me?
Quakers and Methodists.
Quakers and very good. Very good. You're gonna get very high marks in this. Yeah, that was one reason. Certainly after the Revolutionary War, and a document called, what was the document that might have led people to question slavery?
Declaration of Independence.
Called the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And of course, people sat back and said, we just subscribe. Not only did we subscribe to this notion, we fought a war to put this notion in place for us. Us. How about for them? Yes, sir.
The Continental Congress, when we were forming a constitution,
Yeah.
Maryland, Virginia, and North Carolina at the Continental Congress voted to abolish slavery.
Yeah.
It was Georgia and South Carolina that refused to go along
Yeah.
because they didn't have a unanimous vote.
Yeah.
We came up with the
Yeah.
Bill of Rights.
Absolutely. Which leads then to the question.
That's why Maryland was,
Yeah. Which then leads to the question, did the Quakers and the Methodists and others who subscribed have such incredible influence that they led to Maryland being ready to give up slavery? And I would suggest no. I would suggest that was only part of the reason. And that the other part of the reason that many were ready to give up slavery was because
Tobacco was going,
the
tobacco was going down.
Economics.
yeah, economic. You couldn't make a profit with slaves anymore. How come? How come? What had happened from 1700 to 1787 that made slavery at least less profitable and maybe downright unprofitable in a place like Maryland or Virginia? What had occurred?
The tobacco crop failed.
Excuse me?
The tobacco crop failed.
Yeah, tobacco went down the tubes. 1700, tobacco was the crop in Maryland and Virginia. And tobacco needed constant care and cultivation, almost round the clock. It's a little bit of an exaggeration. But by 1730, 1740, 1750, tobacco was played out. It had just exhausted the soil. And something needed to replace it. And what replaced it?
Wheat.
Hmm?
Wheat.
Wheat, and then corn, and soybeans, all that stuff you see out there.
Were tomatoes a biggie for a while?
Hmm?
Tomatoes?
Tomatoes.
They were considered poisonous over 100 years ago.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think they.
And
Is that what they?
And
those crops didn't need constant care.
I didn't know.
And so many farmers who might have owned 5 or 10 enslaved individuals, why am I doing this? Particularly, why am I doing this when if I have 10 enslaved individuals on my farm, at best 5 of them might be productive. 2 or 3 of them are 60 and 70 years old, which was ancient,
50 was considered.
and more of them are 2 and 3 years old, and I gotta support them. Better, I should set them free and hire them. And so that's what many did. So anyway, by the revolution, half free, half slave here in Talbot
Bill,
County.
I have a question.
Excuse me?
What they told us back in junior high school was that many of the slaves would get to keep some of the compensation when they were hired out. And they would buy out their slavery from their owner.
Yeah.
Is that not really accurate?
Yeah. Well, it's like anything else. It's accurate as far as it goes, and it doesn't go a whole lot. Certainly some did. How many? Well, we don't know for sure, but they were certainly a very distinct minority. Because given what those folks were paid,
It would take forever.
and given the exploitation that at least happened on some farms, I mean, how much leverage do you think you had as a black laborer in 1820 if the fellow who's hiring you said, well, I don't think you work very hard. I hired you at $1 a day, but I'm only going to give you 50 cents. Where are you going to go?
Well, not only that, the 50 cents goes to the owner of the slave. I mean,
Yeah.
How is that deal
Yeah,
negotiated?
yeah. So, sure, a few did, no doubt. But it did not happen all that often. Right?
So what about housing for the freed blacks?
What about,
Housing for the freed blacks? Did they just stay where they had always stayed, or did they,
well,
in Unionville, weren't they given some?
free is an interesting term. Number one, even if there were no limitations put on them, they were poor, they were generally illiterate, they were, had no connections, no knowledge of what limited opportunity there might be anywhere else. And so most stayed right where they were. And that was under the best of conditions, because what occurred throughout the South in the period from the Revolutionary War to the Civil War was that, number one, this fervor at the time of the Revolution that Quakers and others engaged in diminished, and in its place, there was more and more hostility towards free blacks. And some of that was fueled by Nat Turner. Who's Nat Turner?
Led a rebellion. Led the slave rebellion.
Yeah, led a slave rebellion. Denmark, BC, led a slave rebellion. Several others throughout the South. And then you layer on that, and those slave rebellions didn't happen very often in the American South, not like in other places in Central and South America, where literally slave rebellions took over entire countries. But the thing that really got the hair up on the back of the neck of Southerners was the rise of a specific political party called
Republicans.
the Republican Party. Okay, I'm done. The Republican Party. And the Republican Party comes into being, at least as one plank of the Republican Party, as being
Anti-slavery.
anti-slavery. Now, the Republican Party, oh, here you got me going on this one. We're supposed to be talking about Unionville. We'll get there, believe me. Lincoln and other Republicans, but Lincoln is the best example, went out of his way to say, yeah, I am anti-slavery. Yes, I think it's horrendous. And yes, I will not touch it in the South. I will not touch it. You elect me president, and now that I'm elected president, you support me as president, I will not touch slavery anywhere where it exists. And he said that over and over and over again in 1858 and 1859 and 1860 when he was angling to become president. And once he becomes president in 1861, he says it again. And in 1862, when the Civil War breaks out, for the first 6 months, he has slaves who flee to the Union Army returned. That's the great emancipator.
There's also a great follower of the Constitution, is then interpreted.
Yeah. Lincoln was firm he was not going to touch slavery where it existed. But, and it was always the but, that he was clear on, absolutely clear, I will not allow it to expand 1 inch. 1 inch. And that was the breaking point for many Southerners, because many Southerners saw that slavery could not endure pent up in these 10, 11, 12, 13 states. They said, look what happened in Maryland. Look what happened in Virginia. Same thing's going to happen in Alabama and Mississippi. We're going to play out the soil. We need to, if slavery is to survive, it needs to expand. And so you had all the turmoil over
Texas.
Texas and California and blah, 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 blah. And Lincoln wouldn't give an inch. And the war came. And a year into the war, Lincoln had an epiphany. Didn't really have an epiphany. Things changed. And Lincoln said, when conditions change, I change. And conditions changed, which was to say, two conditions changed. Number one, the Union Army was getting its head handed to them, particularly in the East. And number two, those goddamn, you'll excuse the expression, black people, what were they doing? What were they doing?
Well, they were deserting the plantation.
Yeah,
The Union Army went.
the Union Army is coming through, particularly in the West. The Union Army's here to free us. And despite the fact that many in the Union Army said, no, you got it wrong, you got it wrong. So they said, we don't got it wrong. Just ask our owners. They say you're here to free us. And so slaves were flocking to the Union Army, And Union commanders were saying, what the hell do we do with them? What do we do with them?
Yeah, followers, for them.
We put them to work. First, they put them to work doing that. And then ultimately, by late 1863, they actually did what?
Fought.
Hmm?
Fought.
Put them in the army. And the Navy to a lesser extent. 190,000 black men were enlisted into the Union Army. Now, most of them continue to do that. Very few of them, even though that's not what gets portrayed in films like Glory and others. And Glory was a very good film, and it was true, but it didn't really give you an accurate assessment of the lives of most black soldiers during the Civil War. Most continued to do this. But interestingly, a couple of regiments of blacks, beyond the ones that were in Glory, did fight. And there were 2 regiments that were drawn from Talbot County that engaged in a lot of combat activity in the last 2 years of the war. The 4th and the 7th Regiment United States Colored Infantry. And funny thing happened. When they came home with 2 things they didn't go away with. Number 1, they had some money in their pockets. Because the commander, Brigadier General Godfrey Weitzel, said, these guys deserve pay. Now, why would that have been an issue? Some people said they don't deserve the pay. Who deserves their pay?
Their owners.
Their owners. And owners did get paid for delivering blacks to the Union Army. Edward Lloyd VII literally marched 100 of his enslaved individuals down to the docks in Easton. They're yours. Give me my money. And they gave him money. $100 a head, I think. He was gifted. But at the end of the war, those same soldiers, Weitzel went to bat for him and said they deserve money too. And so they were given money, but they were given something even more valuable than money.
Self-esteem.
Self-esteem. And an education. Some of very rudimentary education, but an education. Some of them. But most of them were given self-esteem. I am a man. I'm not a slave. And so they come home to Talbot County. And that's where we meet Miles River Neck. Okay? Because on Miles River Neck, literally, to the north, you have Lloyd, okay, with this huge plantation and all these former slaves. some of whom had got into the army, but many more because they were women, because they were children, because they were old. Some of them said, I ain't going in the army. There's some really pretty good stories of, right in here, of black men who said, I can get killed going in the army. One of them shot his foot off
Oh, dear.
so he wouldn't have to go. And another one just took off. And then come 1865, I'm home. So not everybody was into going into the military. Many were, but not everyone. They were human beings, after all, with all the foibles and that human beings are prone to. Anyway, so here we are in Miles River Neck, and something interesting has happened in Miles River Neck. Right before the war, in the mid-1850s, a Quaker family comes down from Delaware and starts a farm right in that what becomes Unionville area. Anybody know their name?
Kogel.
Oh, you should get up there. Yeah. Kogel. First time I gave a lecture and I pronounced it Kogel, and I was severely reprimanded at the end. It's not Kogel, for God's sake. Kogel. Okay. The Kogels. Ezekiel Gogel, his wife, whose name I don't have here, and his two sons, John and James Gogel. And he starts farming. Well, no big deal. Well, the interesting thing was that Kogel wasn't a farmer. He'd never been a farmer. He had been some kind, he had been into manufacturing of some kind in Delaware. And he comes here to Miles River Neck in mid-1850s and he takes up farming. And there's a suspicion on some folks' part that he's up to more than just farming. Particularly when he hires free blacks to work for him and pays them what was for that day a living wage and treats them decently. And then when 1860 comes along and there's an election for the president, and in Talbot County, there are 2 votes cast for Abraham Lincoln.
Jesus.
And the 2 votes were Ezekiel and his son. One of his sons, the other son was off someplace. And he lets it be known. I don't have a quote here, but he's got this incredible quote where he equates the plantation owners, the slave owners, with the slave owners in the Bible in Egypt. And he says this publicly, okay? So he was not too popular, but he didn't care. After the war is over, Kogel has a plan. And his plan is he's going to start a black town. And in order to facilitate this town and its establishment, he is going to rent acreage, small plots, to blacks, which is what he begins to do in 1867. And by 1870, a town begins to form around these homesteads, if you want to call it that. Initially, the town is called Kogeltown. At least that's what whites in the area call it. Kogel said, no. We're not calling it Kogeltown. We're calling it Unionville. Unionville. Like the Union Army. Talk about rubbing it in. He was not above rubbing it in. His son, John, who had been at war, he had fought in the Union Army, comes home and has political ambitions, Republican political ambitions. And so his son, John, begins to whip up support for himself. In fact, before the election in 1870, John gets dressed up in his Union outfit and rides into Easton on his horse with former black soldiers dressed in their outfits as well on election day. Now, how do you think that went over with the good residents of Easton in 1870? 1870 was the first election after the 14th and 15th Amendment in which blacks could vote. John didn't win. His father also ran for office. His father, Ezekiel, runs for office against our friend Edmund Lloyd. Edward Lloyd. Lloyd beats him for the congressional seat. John disappears. He loses elections, he disappears, he goes to Delaware to seek his fortune. But his son James, not his son, his brother James, takes up residence with his father and mother. And by 1880, James takes over. His father is old, says, I've had enough. James takes over. And for the next 40 years, from 1880 to 1920, James does something even more radical than what his father had done. His father had leased land to blacks at very low rates, $1 an acre a year. And if you couldn't pay it in cash, pay me in potatoes or pay me in tomatoes or whatever. But James goes one step further. What does he do?
Gives it the land. Sells.
He sells it. He sells it.
We might note that it is not the most desirable land on the Kogel plantation, and I'm desperately trying to think of the name of the Kogel plantation. I know
Yeah.
where it is. It's very low land.
Yeah.
And to this day, if we have a heavy rain, you find out how low it is.
Yeah. There's some suspicion along those lines that James was not being completely altruistic in this effort. That he was not quite as committed as his father, and this was an effort to get rid of some acreage. But that being said, nobody else was selling land to blacks to farm in Talbot County that I'm aware of, at least not in that section, Miles River Neck, during this period of time. James also sells land to whites at higher rates. Now, they may have been better parcels of land, but in any case, Let me see here. I've got some, begin selling land, and he sells land at roughly $100, $100 to $125 for an acre of land, which for that day was pretty low rates. When he sold to White's, and if you go over to the courthouse, at least before they had the disaster over in the courthouse a year ago, where the
Fire.
the fire and the water and all. I haven't gotten back in to take a look at the land documents since. But prior to that, the land documents were fascinating to look at as he would sell his land off to blacks and whites. Okay, so what occurs then? Unionville as a village is established. By 1880, there's close to 400 individuals living in Unionville. 300, sorry. 46 households, 56 families, and approximately 300 individuals. Now, 300 individuals in 46 households sort of suggests these were pretty big households. For blacks coming out of slavery, the notion of household was a little different than our notion. Our notion tends to be the nuclear family. That was very often not the case. The notion of family had a much expanded definition for these folks than our definition. But in any case, not only was there 46 households, there's a school that's established there, there's a store that's established there, and there is, most importantly, a church that's established in Unionville. And then beyond that, there are some other organizations. Again, if you go into the land records, you will see that particularly the black veterans, and the veterans really were about 1/3 of the population. Even though if you go over to Unionville today and you take a look, the sense you get was black veterans were the people who settled the town. And it's really an exaggeration. But what's not an exaggeration is that the veterans seem to have taken the leadership in the town after the Civil War. That certainly seems to be the case. They set up a chapter of the GAR. What's the GAR?
Grand Army of the Republic,
Which is what?
Republican.
So veterans.
Yeah, it's a veterans organization. They set up their own chapter of the GAR in Unionville. They set up their own chapter of the GAR because
Segregation.
Hmm?
They weren't allowed to join.
Yeah, they weren't allowed into the chapter of the GAR that's established in Easton. Even though the GAR was set up for all Union veterans. GAR very proud to put that forward. We're here for all veterans, except if you're black. At least in Easton, you couldn't join. Some other chapters in other areas, particularly the North, did allow black veterans in.
The way Unionville looks today doesn't seem to tie to this farming. I mean, because you see all these small houses
Yeah.
locked up. I mean, the church is there
Yeah.
and the cemetery is there. But what happened to the,
Well, there wasn't much more back in that day.
Okay.
I mean, we talk town, we tend to think in terms of this, municipal infrastructure. What there was beyond the church, there was a store. Store is no longer there. The store disappears by the 1920s and 1930s, if I'm not mistaken. Certainly by the 50s, it's gone.
So is the farming just behind those
Well,
houses?
again, what they were sold were small plots of land.
Okay.
So I'm not aware that any black individual in Unionville could keep body and soul together based on what they grew on their plot. In fact, that then leads me to the next point. 1880, you have about 300 individuals. By 1900, that shrunk down to about 100 individuals. And if you read things, again, like this, you'll find exactly why that's the case. Why?
The economy.
Jim Crow.
Yeah. You could not keep body and soul together farming 1 and 2 acres in Unionville. And so particularly the men said, we've got a family to feed, we've got a household to feed. And so 1 or 2 things happen in a mix of them. Sometimes the men would simply take off. I don't mean desert their family, I mean, we're going to Baltimore. And we're going to work in Baltimore for 6 months, we're going to work in Baltimore for a year, and we're going to come home with some money to support the family. So that happened frequently, that you had this kind of commuting, if you want to call it that. But in many other cases, just the whole family picked up and left and moved to Baltimore, moved to Washington, and then someone was talking about the North. By the 1920s and 1930s, New York, Chicago became goals as well for many of these individuals. Another challenge that these folks had, again, these were, many of them, former slaves. Some of them had served in the military, doing god-awful work. And there was not such a thing as medical services available in Unionville. And there were damn few doctors in Easton who were going to serve. Although, in that reminiscence, he does indicate that there was one doctor in Easton. You went through the back door and you could get yourself served by this one doctor in Easton. But medical services were very minimal. The result being that mortality rates were not good in Unionville in particular. And many of the folks here who were left behind, who didn't move to Baltimore, who didn't move to Washington, were folks who couldn't. There was no sense in it. Because we're infirm here, we're going to be infirm there too. And so Unionville became a place where the very young, the very old, and more often than not, women resided. Men of working age and working ability simply were no longer to be found. How do we know that? Well, and I haven't been doing this, have I? Yet so there's Edward Lloyd V. That's the 7th Regiment, United States Colored Troops. Now, it'd be wonderful if we knew individuals and which of those individuals came back and settled and which did not, but we don't. They're not identified.
Were they Corps of Engineers?
Excuse me?
Were they Corps of Engineers?
No.
You sure?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I've gone through the regimental detail. No.
Yeah, it's the seventh was.
Mr. and Mrs. Cogill. And there is John. That's the one who tried to establish a political career for himself and was unsuccessful. And there is St. Stephen's Church. That is
Still there.
the one residue of the infrastructure of the town that's still there. Now, St. Stephen's Church was built a little later on, 1892, 93, 94. Town itself was by that time 20, 25 years old. And they had a succession prior to the building of the church of temporary quarters. And then they did a fundraising to establish this church. Let's see. There's the Union. No, I don't have that. And there's a list that I found of people who contributed to the building of the church in 1892, when there were approximately 100 residents in Unionville, and the list is over 200 people. Almost 250 people contributed to the building of that church. Now, I think the largest contribution was something like $10 or $15, and the average contribution was something like $2, which was a reflection of the economic circumstances of these individuals. But what's interesting beyond that is, number one, 200 to 250 people contribute to building a church in a town that's got 100 residents. And from that, at least I draw the conclusion that Unionville was more than a physical entity. That Unionville was, in fact, in some sense, a state of mind for many Black individuals on Miles River Neck. Again, to go back to our friend, he talks about, he didn't live in Unionville. He did when he was real old. But prior to that, he lived in Copperville. Copperville is not around the block from Unionville. He and many others like him walked to that church every Sunday. Walked to that church.
Copperville had a church. At one
He walked to Unionville. In fact, he
Was it?
points out, oh yeah, there was a church, but it wasn't my church. This church had much more of a draw than the Copperville church. So you had over 200 individuals from throughout Miles River Neck who contributed to it. And if you look at the list, I didn't count. I suppose I should have, but I didn't. But I swear 80 to 90% of them are female. Are female. Now, that reflects a couple of things. Number one, it reflects just the general population by that time. Again, many of the men had gone elsewhere. But I also think it reflects the fact that by that time, women had become really the institutional glue for many Black communities. Not just here in Unionville, not just here on Easton, but throughout the South, had become the institutional glue. And to a certain extent, my own impression is that persists today as well. And it seems to me that's reflected here. So Unionville declines. That's the list of the Union soldiers. Interestingly, that's the 18 or 19 Union soldiers, and this list is constantly referred to. When you read about Unionville today, when some reporter decides he's going to do a story, inevitably they'll talk about this. The interesting thing is, I went through the census, and half of these fellows I can't find. Now, I'm not sure what that means. Of course, the census was only taken every 10 years, and you could have lived in Unionville from 1873 to 1878 and not hit either census. That's always a possibility. But I think the other possibility is that, again, Unionville being a state of mind as much as a geographical location, some of these fellows never lived in what we call Unionville, but were in some way, shape, or form connected to it. Yes, sir.
But aren't most of those buried at St. Stephen's?
I'm sorry.
Aren't most of those buried at St. Stephen's?
Yeah,
Yes, it's buried here.
yeah, most of them are, which then brings us to that. In back of the church, there is a graveyard. And it's sort of fascinating to walk through. This is the grave of Frederick Pipes. Frederick Pipes was one of those, I believe he was in the 7th regiment. Does that say 7th or 4th? Maybe it doesn't say. He was in one of those 2 regiments. He had been a slave before the war. He comes back to Unionville, and he is the last of the 18 to die and be buried in the Unionville cemetery. Not only was he the last, he was also one of those fellows who was very much involved in setting up the infrastructure of the town. He was a pretty remarkable guy. It's unfortunate that there's very little beyond, official records to tease out his history, because I think it would probably be a remarkable history if you could find more documentation. So, Pipes dies, the town shrinks, but the town doesn't go away. And in my mind, that's one of the remarkable things. It doesn't go away. And if you read some of the reminiscences of people who are alive today, they speak glowingly of growing up in Unionville. Now, some of that, of course, us old folks have a way of looking back 50, 60 years and say, wasn't it wonderful back then? But there was, I think, a sense, even into the 30s, 40s, and 50s, that this was an enclave, sheltered, in a sense, from the storm. It was, as we started out, a home of their own, secure And again, somebody growing up in the 1950s, black, wasn't a whole lot better than growing up in the 1870s, black. In Unionville, though, there was a sense of security, a sense of oneness that couldn't be found many other places. Unionville's still there. Many of you have been through it. It's beginning, in my estimation, not beginning, the school is gone, and the school became a community center, and the community center is gone, and some rich, or at least affluent, fellow bought it up and tore it down, and you can't even see the house anymore. It looks like many of the houses or many of the plots of ground that you see throughout the rural area of the county, where the house is down a
Big long lane.
down a long lane, buried beneath the trees. That may or may not be the fate of Unionville going forward. Which sort of then, what do we have here? 11, 12. Sort of then brings us to the last chapter, not so much with Unionville, but in terms of the whole theme here of, Talbot County, this very distinctive place, and is it going to stay distinctive? Is it changing? Should it change? And if it should change, how should it change? Should more housing developments of the sort that you see down in Trappe be encouraged? Should more retail establishments be encouraged in order to allow folks who can't afford to shop at Home Depot be able to shop at places they can afford? Should we protect what makes Talbot County distinctive? Should Talbot County continue to be the land of the gentry? Those sort of questions are interesting ones. I don't have an answer. I have a feeling you folks may have more of a feel for that, the answers to those questions, than I do. I've only been here 6, 7 years. Some of you have been here forever. What's your sense? Is it changing? Should it change?
Well,
Where should it go?
Isn't the should it change question really, it's almost irrelevant, because the question, change is going to come.
Uh-huh.
The question is, what do we want it to look like to the extent we have control?
And what do we want it to look like?
I know what I don't want it to look like, and that's Rockville, Maryland, when I was a kid growing up.
Yeah.
That's what I'm afraid of. I'm kind of afraid it will, but it'll be slow. I won't see it.
Yeah. Yeah. I've got a daughter who lives in Bethesda.
Yeah, I spent many a year there.
Yeah. That's why I came across the bridge. I got a feeling that's why a lot
I
of
just
people came.
think of one development that that land that's on the corner of the bypass and Oxford Road. That's going to be huge. And that's going to happen.
What is the plan for that lot? Does anybody know?
Yeah, it's Poplar Hill,
Poplar Hill, which is.
429 units plus commercial
Yeah.
plus.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. It's going to
Wow, that's so big.
That was the original.
That's right there.
The Annabelle, that was the hospital's property, wasn't it?
Right.
Originally.
But it's a critical area. I forget, a significant percentage.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's all kinds of things about it, right? You know, the drainage, that it's in an area that is, would just change the nature of that whole section of town. Because it's been farmland forever, and now it's gonna be,
Yeah, how do you think I didn't want to be on the planning commission anymore?
Get you back on.
yeah.
No.
Yeah, I do a lot of bike riding. And one of the things that I love about the county and is that I can get on my bike and I can ride 30 miles and never hit a major road. You know, my biggest threat is to those trucks full of corn or whatever. Other than that, or a tractor that's as big as the road. Other than that, you know, I can just go and go.
If you're out in the farmland.
Yeah,
But once you get close to town,
yeah,
that's all changing.
yeah.
See, that's where planning comes in, though. That's in
Lynn?
large measure intentional.
I was going to say that if you're concerned about the future of this town, you need to come to planning commission meetings. They will listen to you. You have an opportunity to speak out. You also have an opportunity to be involved in both the town and the county are in the process of redoing their plan. What do you call the plan?
Comprehensive.
The comprehensive plan. Now, what I see when I go to these meetings is that developers come in and they go through that plan and they say, well, the plan doesn't say I can't do this, so you can't stop me. And that is the problem. We have to have a comprehensive plan that is meeting the needs and hearing the voice of our community.
And you have to have a council who's willing to enforce that plan.
And a
And
yes,
you don't have that.
and a planning commission that's willing to enforce the plan.
But it has no enforcement power.
Right.
Yeah.
The town
If it's a
attorney,
town
the town
council
attorney will say,
around.
no, you can't do that because it's not in the documents. So we have to, those plans are in the process of being redone right now. And this is your opportunity, so please, don't be silent.
Well, I went to the town planning commission when they were talking, I think it might have been the last one, that the development that's on, next to Easton Club East.
Right.
And 90% of that is a fait accompli. I mean, there might be small things about what's gonna happen
Yeah,
with this little
right.
park.
What it's gonna look like. But get back to the comp plan, that was definitely contemplated in the comp plan.
Bob, just jump in.
I would like to say that elections have consequences. And so think carefully on how you are about to vote this next month. I can make one reflection. I spent a big part of my youth in Sussex County, Delaware. And yesterday we were down visiting my sister in Lewis, Rehoboth. We pulled out of a brand new taco place onto Route 1. And I was wondering, when the hell I was gonna be able to pull out into traffic? It reminded me, we had a ranch just outside of Camp Pendleton in California. Every once in a while, going to Anaheim. And Ball Road is one of the main drags through Anaheim, one of the biggest cities in California. And Route 1 yesterday in Rehoboth was busier than Ball Road. When I was a kid, I could have, at this time of the year now, let's pick February. In February, I could sit down on Route 1 in the middle of the road and wait for a couple of hours to go by before a car passed. So what has happened in Sussex County is they have put no forethought into the growth and the infrastructure. So think about how you vote on November 8th
Yeah.
and hold the councils accountable.
I mean, I don't know much about Delaware, but the impression I got is that they did give thought and that was a conscious decision.
Yeah, it was
To let that kind of growth.
Unfettered growth.
Yeah,
And it's
Yeah,
And now they pay the price.
What the real problem is with land use planning is the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution. I mean, there's a direct conflict between people's right to dispose of their property and the
Right.
public planning kind of role, and that the tension just doesn't go away.
yeah.
It's always in play.
Yes,
You
sir.
know.
Yeah.
When you were talking about, the last class, when you were talking about the size of the lots in Talbot County,
Yeah,
and you were talking about the 2-acre rule,
yeah.
I couldn't tell whether you were being critical or whether you supported it.
I can't tell whether I'm being critical or not.
There's a legal requirement.
Yeah, although,
I perked 2 lots, so I can tell you that in this county, it's a sandbar.
yeah,
What it is.
yeah,
And the aquifer
yeah,
is, to get good water, you gotta go down 500 feet.
yeah,
And the water table is also very high,
yeah,
so to perk a lot in Talbot County is rough work, because I had to have 50-foot setbacks
yeah,
all around my lot.
yeah,
I had to have the well 100 feet from the sediment control area.
yeah.
And then you had to fit a house into a 3-acre lot.
So,
And then I ran into the same problem out on Route 50.
yeah,
I had to do the same thing, I had a 4-acre lot,
yeah.
50-foot setback, 150 from Route 50.
So
I
you're
wound up
saying
with
you
a building.
need that kind of acreage?
You have to, because you're
Yeah.
you're just polluting yourself with your own waste products.
Yeah.
That's why here, you're in our meeting area, and it's intentional, the development is concentrated on Easton,
Yeah,
not outside of the county limits, and that's a good reason.
Yeah.
You build the neatest.
so, any of you folks want to contribute to the discussion here? No. Okay, that's fine. Let me give you a shot at it, though.
Well,
I think it's
Anything else?
time. Thank you so much, Bill, for doing this. It's been
Yes.
very interesting
Yeah.
3 sessions. And if anyone has further questions, Bill will be around for a little while. Grab him and ask.
Yeah, well, it's been my pleasure. I learned a lot, so thank you for putting up with me.